Did you just shove my wife in front of our house? Yeah? All right then. I once broke the wrists of 3 kidnappers in the dark, and now there's enough light for everyone to see you. His name is Tobias Nash, and what he carries isn't a gun or a title. It's the memory of 3 classified missions, 7 brushes with death, and a vow to never let injustice slide on American soil. The armored enforcer was still smirking when he struck. 1 second later, he was pinned to the grass, handcuffed in front of Tobias's wife, the neighbors, and the very cameras he thought would protect him. He picked the wrong woman to humiliate, and the wrong man, one capable of exposing this sick HOA system with nothing more than a report and a stare cold as steel. You messed with the wrong people. This time, I'm the last man you'll ever lay a hand on. What state are you in, and does the HOA where you live truly protect you or control you? The sun had just risen over the horizon, casting a pale glow across the Willow Ridge neighborhood. The front lawns were still slick with dew, but Jenna Cruz had already begun her day. She slowly dragged the long garden hose toward the edge of the fence, carefully adjusting the spray to avoid splashing the neighbor's porch. Her breath mingled with the crisp air, footsteps moving over the stone walkway like she had memorized every brick, as if she had laid them herself the day she moved in. In that usual quiet, the roar of an SUV engine broke the morning air. A dark gray vehicle rolled onto the grass border, parked well over the curb. 2 men stepped out, shoulders clad in rigid armor, bold letters printed across their chests, HSD, enforcement. One of them, tall, pale, skinned, with eyes cold enough to skip a morning greeting entirely, walked straight toward Jenna. His voice rang out across the yard, still thick with the scent of damp grass. You're trespassing on protected landscape. Cease use of community resources immediately. Jenna glanced over the fence line and pointed to the grass beneath her feet. This is my yard. The boundary runs behind that planter. She spoke calmly, every word measured, as if rehearsed, but he didn't stop. The man stepped forward, cut through the water stream, and without warning grabbed her wrist. Step back from community property. His voice dropped, but he pressed hard, leaving no room for debate. Jenna pulled her arm away, but before she could react, his other hand slammed onto her shoulder, shoving her backward. Her body lost balance, crashing down onto the stone steps by the porch, her back hitting the hard surface, her right arm slamming against the edge. There was no loud crack, but the pain needed no sound. A few leaves tumbled from a nearby planter, scattered across the pavement, mingling with her wide eyes as she stared up at the man who had just shoved her. In those few seconds, the world went silent, except for the faint trickle of water still dripping onto the ground. Across the street, a neighbor raised their phone to record, hands slightly trembling as the lens captured a middle-aged woman being thrown down in front of her own house, with no one reaching out to help. The front door swung open. Tobias Nash stepped out, coffee still streaked faintly on his hand from the cup he had just set down inside. He didn't run, he didn't shout. He walked down the 3 porch steps, eyes flicking quickly to Jenna's swelling wrist, then locking onto the man who still stood stiff from the shove. He spoke, voice low and steady, every word clipped like a tactical command. Did you just put your hands on my wife in her own yard? No wasted words, no dramatic rage, but each syllable hit the air like a bullet chambered and waiting for someone careless enough to pull the trigger. The enforcer stepped back slightly, still not noticing anything unusual about the man in front of him. No badge, no uniform, just unblinking eyes and a right shoulder stance locked in with military precision. Tobias didn't have to reach out to help his wife up. Jenna was already sitting up on her own, though her movements were clearly strained. She quietly pressed her left hand against her right wrist, head lowered not out of shame, but calculating how to stand when pain made it hard to breathe. Tobias didn't look at his wife, but he knew she wouldn't say a word. That silence wasn't weakness, but a choice made by someone who had been underestimated too many times and no longer needed to prove anything. He turned to the man who had just assaulted her. I'll ask once, who are you in this system? The man snapped back. We're the enforcement unit under the HOA. She trespassed. Tobias tilted his head slightly, as if weighing whether the man had just labeled himself beyond the point of discussion. Then he looked him straight in the face. Enforcement units have no right to make physical contact unless there's a life-threatening risk. She was holding a garden hose, not a knife. At that moment, the person filming across the street stepped closer. Light glinted off the phone screen, capturing Tobias's face calm to the point of being unsettling. The second enforcer, seemingly less aggressive, started to step in, but Tobias shifted, turning his left shoulder slightly, sliding his right foot back half a step, a stance only recognizable to someone who had made it through the first year of Special Forces training. The man froze immediately. Tobias hadn't laid a finger on anyone, but control no longer belonged to the HSD team. He looked at the lettering on the back of their vests. Is that a company name or a warning label? One of them tried to smirk, but it vanished the moment Tobias stepped in close. I trained the people who wrote the Federal Civil Defense Code. I taught them how to assess threat levels in under 3 seconds, and I'm counting to too. Jenna rose slowly. No one helped her, but the entire block saw she didn't need help. Her arm was bruised but steady. Her eyes glistened, but didn't shake. Tobias motioned to the person filming. "Keep recording. Make 3 copies. Send one to the email I'm about to give you." His voice was so firm that both enforcers hesitated mid-breath. Tobias's composure left no opening for interruption. He didn't strike, but in every step, every word, every silence, it was clear this incident wasn't going to pass like the ones before. When one of the HSD agents whispered into his radio, "Call the police to the scene," Tobias didn't turn around. He spoke as if he had heard the frequency himself. "Police? Perfect. Make sure they bring a copy of the current statutes and be ready for a call from SecNav Command. They know my name." And for the first time, the eyes of the 2 men across from him finally lowered. Not because they knew who he was, but because they had just realized they didn't and should have found out before laying a hand on the woman standing beside him. The moment Tobias Nash stepped forward, the air around the porch tightened. The first enforcer, the one who had shoved Jenna, hardened his expression, eyes flicking toward his partner as if signaling for backup. The second man, shorter but quicker, stepped in decisively, hand tightening around the baton already drawn from his belt. He stood less than 2 meters from Tobias, staring him down. "You are obstructing official enforcement. We are authorized to handle landscape violations under Provision 14C. His voice was stiff, as if reciting from a printout, and his eyes carried the kind of counterfeit authority people confuse for power when they wear armor. Tobias didn't move. He watched the man in front of him as if calculating the thickness of his vest, the angle of his shoulder rotation, and the point most likely to break balance. But his words said something else entirely. "Enforcement? You mean twisting my wife's wrist on the lawn she planted with her own hands? Or shoving a woman over an invisible line you people made up just to play lawmaker?" His voice lowered, pressed hard on every syllable. He didn't need to raise his tone. Each sentence landed like a slap across the man's face. The second enforcer furrowed his brow and shifted forward, but the first one raised a hand to stop him. The caution in his eyes was unmistakable, yet it only seemed to fuel the other's need to assert control. He stepped half a pace closer, raised his right arm, and swung the baton straight at Tobias. "Residents don't give orders to enforcement. Step back, or be penalized for obstruction." The words barely left his mouth when the baton came slicing down like a punishment. But before it reached its mark, Tobias had already moved, shifting his weight, lowering his stance, left hand rising to catch the baton dead center, right arm crossing and pressing into the man's elbow with a counter rotation. In a blink, the baton clattered to the stone floor and rolled toward the porch edge. The enforcer stumbled off balance, wrist locked in a reverse grip, head tilted slightly right from the pressure at his shoulder joint. Tobias didn't look around. He leaned in close to the man's ear, voice low enough to chill bone. "You should check IDs before you lay hands on a SEAL family." A long silence followed. No one spoke. Neighbors held their breath. The person filming tightened their grip on the phone. Disbelief etched across their face as they realized they had just captured a move that was both surgical and silent. No excessive violence, no chaos. Jenna, though her arm still ached, stood tall, her gaze unwavering. She knew he wouldn't cross the line, but the line Tobias drew was nothing like the ones these enforcers were used to. Tobias released the man's wrist, letting him stumble back a few steps, face pale, mouth stammering. You just assaulted an enforcement officer." Tobias raised an eyebrow. "If that actually happened, you'd be lying under those steps right now, not standing there shaking." The statement flushed the baton, wielder's face red, but he didn't dare reply. The crowd started murmuring. An older woman near the trash bin spoke up. "I've lived here 15 years, never seen anything like this morning." They pushed her down like she was an animal. A man beside her nodded. "This is enforcement? Feels more like intimidation. What if he hadn't come out in time?" First enforcer, now finally stepping forward, lowered his tone. "Look, you don't want to make this worse. We're just doing our job under the HOA. Tobias turned, pointing directly at the ground. "What job lets you lay hands on my wife? What regulation lets you bark orders in a resident's front yard? If you're going to cite rules, read the right part. Any physical contact with residents without an immediate threat is considered assault, and you just committed it on camera, in front of my neighbor." At that moment, the phone across the street chimed. A video had just been sent. The man filming looked up at Tobias and called out, "I just uploaded the clip to 3 platforms. One's going up on Reddit, one's been sent to the local news station, and one's backed up to my personal drive." Tobias didn't thank him. He didn't need to. But his glance toward the man served as a silent confirmation the momentum had shifted. From the alley, the The sound of a police siren echoed. Tobias stepped back half a pace, as if staying only to watch the final scene play out. But before the patrol car arrived, he added one more line, eyes still locked on the two men in front of him. I've served in Syria, in Yemen, in North Africa, and I've never seen anyone in armor look as fragile as you two. The one who had been restrained bit his lip, his arm still frozen. The other clutched his radio but didn't switch it on. The patrol car stopped. Two officers stepped out, one with a notepad, the other with a hand resting near his belt. Before they could speak, a woman from the crowd called out, I recorded the whole thing. That woman was pushed down, and her husband only reacted afterward. Jenna remained still, saying nothing, not asking for help. Tobias spoke just once as the officers approached. My name is Tobias Nash, former SEAL. This is my home, that's my wife, and this is the baton they raised against us. He bent down, picked up the weapon, and laid it squarely on the porch step, like evidence beyond dispute. The officer paused, writing his name, then stopped at the last. Nash, you from Echo 9? Tobias neither nodded nor denied it. But it was enough for the officer to glance at Jenna, then take half a step back. Not out of fear, but because he understood this wasn't something a local precinct could quietly resolve. It had already passed that point, and now it was brushing against the front lines of media, military, and federal law. Tobias turned to his wife and said softly, we need to wrap your wrist. Jenna nodded. The two of them walked back into the house, with no need to explain anything to each other. But behind them, the ones who had believed they held control were already stepping back, not because they had just lost a scuffle, but because they had just lost to a principle. That same afternoon, as the sun softened and the sound of police sirens no longer echoed in her head, Jenna Cruz sat at her desk, her right hand resting gently on a fabric cushion to keep her wrist from pressing against the surface. She opened her inbox, checking for emails from the HOA out of habit after any incident involving the neighborhood. It wasn't hope she was looking for, just confirmation that indifference was still functioning on schedule. Sure enough, the subject line was bold. Regarding the morning of the 23rd, report from HSD enforcement. She clicked it open. The first line on screen read, we regret the inconvenience caused, but based on initial review, the HSD officers acted within safety protocol to ensure proper control of community property. Jenna wasn't surprised, but a cold stillness crept into her chest. The language was so casual, as if her swollen wrist didn't make it difficult to move, as if the assault could be equated with late trash pickup or crooked parking. She opened her messaging app, transferred the video her neighbor had sent earlier to her desktop, then attached the CT scan of her wrist, the photo of the bruising, and still images pulled from the moment she was shoved. Each file was named clearly, precisely. Timestamp _08H21_impact.jpg, CT, carpal, fracture, right. PDF, still _08H22_face.jpg. No emotion. No commentary. She sent them all back, with a subject line that read, Supplemental Evidence, Morning of the 23rd Incident. 5 minutes later, a reply came from Marla Griggs, the HOA's community liaison, who had been seen at many neighborhood meetings, always in a cream silk blouse, speaking in a voice that sounded like market announcement. Her email began with, Thank you, Jenna, for forwarding your materials. We understand the event may have been stressful, but please note the video does not clearly capture full audio from HSD personnel. Then came a stranger line still. This may have been an unintended misunderstanding. Residents are also advised to avoid obstructing the line of sight for enforcement officers while they are working, for example, watering near grass border areas. Jenna read that line twice, then a third time. She placed her left hand on her forehead, not out of fatigue, but trying to decide whether the wording had been chosen by someone incompetent or by a system too used to assigning blame without consequence. She turned the screen toward Tobias. He stepped closer, still carrying the faint scent of menthol from the ointment, standing beside her without needing to read past the second sentence. Jenna said softly, like delivering a quiet sentence, they're justifying the shove. Tobias nodded, eyes fixed on the digital signature at the bottom of the email. And I'm not letting them shove again. His voice didn't rise, but the words landed like they had been carved into the stone steps of their front porch. Jenna replayed the video and scrubbed to the frame at 8:21 and 37 seconds the moment the enforcer reached out and shoved her off balance. Each motion froze in place. The large, rough hand, her shirt twisted at the shoulder, her eyes wide in shock, and the slate surface where her right hand struck. Each detail captured from the right angle left no room for interpretation as obstructing line of sight. Jenna knew she couldn't dismantle the entire HOA with a single video, but she also knew that once something had been caught on camera, it couldn't be rewritten with an empty apology. Tobias opened his own laptop and began drafting a formal statement, not to send to the HOA, but to attach in a message directed to the city's Civil Rights Oversight Office. He didn't use the word complaint, nor did he label it accusation. The first line read, Request for review of overreach by enforcement enforcement agents lacking lawful authority for physical coercion. From beginning to end, he never mentioned his SEAL background. He didn't need to. Footage and the HOA's response already painted the distorted picture of power he wanted others to see. Outside, the afternoon sun began to hit the rooftops of the neighborhood. A child pedaled slowly past the crew's mailbox, which now bore a small paper sign. In bold print, "This is where a resident was shoved in front of their child." The boy stared at the words for a moment, then kept riding but glanced back as he went. And somewhere in the neighborhood, someone had snapped a photo of that sign, posting it online with a short caption, "They may fall, but no one forget." The spread started with something small, and the system long used to brushing things aside was, for the first time, facing consequences it couldn't rewrite into a memo. By early evening, when every sound in the neighborhood had softened beneath porches glowing in sunset light, Jenna received a quiet but weighty message. A neighbor named Aiden, who lived in the house directly behind, sent a video link. "Backyard camera. Might have what you need." She opened it. The angle tilted from the top right, showing the entire incident from a direction no one had noticed. There was no sound, but the footage said more than 1,000 words. In the video, Jenna was crouched down watering, hand on the sprayer, hair tied back, with nothing blocking visibility as the HOA had previously claimed. The two HSD enforcers entered from the frame's edge, moving without urgency but with clear intent. The lead man stopped directly behind Jenna, placed his hand on her shoulder without signaling, without speaking. As she turned, he raised his other hand as if to measure the boundary, then abruptly shoved forward her shoulder driven back, her balance lost, and her body falling across the edge of the stone walkway. All of it happened in 8 seconds. No warning, no map check, no explanation, just a raw push, delivered from a power no one had granted but everyone had come to expect. Tobias watched the footage 3 times. First, with the focus of a soldier analyzing a battlefield. Second, as a husband watching the moment his wife was pushed. Third, frame by frame in slow motion, then saved it under the file name, Exhibit B camera. Third party, MP4. He opened a small file drawer and pulled out the certified property deed for 14B Maple Crest, their home. In the property boundary section, it clearly stated the grass area where Jenna had been watering was fully within their private lot, not public space as claimed in the HSD report. He sent both files, the video and the deed, to their attorney, with a short note, "They got the boundary wrong, and the person." The attorney replied with a single checkmark. Tobias needed nothing more. He returned to his desk and composed a third message to the HOA board, attaching the 2 files, with the subject line, "Submission of additional evidence and request for legal verification." The HOA's response arrived not long after. Marla Griggs replied with the same template they'd grown accustomed to. "We acknowledge receipt of the third-party resident video. The incident is under internal review. In the meantime, we encourage all parties to remain cooperative and refrain from circulating unverified information." Tobias read it once, said nothing. He opened his browser, downloaded the civil complaint form, and began filling in the fields. Physical misconduct, bodily harm, and abuse of enforcement authority. Under responsible parties, he wrote HOA Maple Crest and HSD contractors listed in the assignment log for the 23rd. When he reached the signature field, he paused, then signed in blue ink, Tobias Eli Nash. He attached all supporting files, submitted a digital copy to the local legal system, and printed a hard copy to file in person the next morning. No one called, no one warned them, but social media had already moved faster. A Reddit user using footage from the third-party camera clipped the moment Jenna was shoved and captioned it with a line spreading rapidly. He didn't shout, he filed. The line, sharp and cold like Tobias's expression in the video, became the unofficial headline of an entire discussion. In the comments, hundreds of people began sharing stories of how residents had been threatened by non-police enforcement groups, HOA Karens, hiding behind regulations to pressure the vulnerable. Another user added a comparison. In another state, he could have been arrested for interfering with an officer. Here, he's the only one acting like an actual citizen. No one needed to know who Tobias was, but everyone recognized his silence wasn't submission, it was preparation. Every word he spoke had been structured ahead of time, deliberately. And the most unsettling part wasn't the wrist lock in part 2 of the video, but the composure of a man who had discipline wired into his blood, and was now using it to confront a system built on borrowed authority. That night, with most of the house lights off, Tobias sat in the kitchen, reviewing the list of next steps. He marked the priority items in red, file the petition with the city council, submit a separate complaint to the Civilian Conduct Review Office, and contact the local press. Jenna walked in, her left arm still wrapped in a soft bandage, eyes scanning the list before pausing on one short line. Collect resident testimony, she asked. What do you think they'll say? Tobias replied, doesn't matter what they say, as long as they saw it, and now they know silence is a kind of complicity. Meanwhile, the video tagged "Justice Served" continued to spread. An Instagram user edited 2 scenes together, one of Jenna falling, the other of Tobias blocking the baton and countering set to tense music, styled like a silent documentary. No voiceover was needed. Just the closing line across the final frame, "They picked the wrong man, he picked the right way." On Thursday evening, the first-floor multi-purpose room of the Maple Crest Community Center lit up earlier than usual. White plastic chairs were arranged in neat rows, with a narrow aisle leading to a small platform where the HOA board sat facing the residents. A sign reading, "Open Meeting Resident Forum" hung on the front door, but everyone knew true dialogue rarely happened. These meetings were typically a formality where Marla Griggs and a few others read out decisions already made, then closed with minutes no one contested hard enough to matter. But tonight, the atmosphere was different. Tobias entered without a word, holding an A3-sized printed map of the property boundary and a folder containing the ownership documents. He sat in the third row, not too close, not too far, folder on his lap, eyes locked on the front. Jenna followed, her arm still bandaged, sitting beside him with a gaze sharper than usual. Marla began with her usual smooth delivery. "We thank all residents for attending. As you know, recent days have brought an unfortunate incident involving HHSD personnel and the residents at 14B. The board has received video, documents, and responses from various parties and, after thorough review, we believe the HSD team acted in accordance with safety standards to preserve community order and landscape integrity." As soon as the sentence ended, Tobias stood no request to speak, no polite framing. He walked directly to the front table and placed an open laptop on the wooden surface. He hit play. The projector behind them lit up, showing Jenna watering the plants. No one spoke during the first 10 seconds. On the 11th, a large hand reached into the frame, touched Jenna's shoulder, and shoved. She fell onto the walkway, water splashing from the hose, the video freezing at the moment her hand struck the stone edge. There was no audio, but the silence in the room was louder than any noise. Marla gripped her file folder, her eyes shifting away. A resident in the back whispered, "That's a real injury." Tobias turned toward the man, voice cutting through the room. "Yes, it is a real injury. I've watched teammates go down because they trusted clarity that never came. On the battlefield, you don't get the luxury of guessing wrong. Here, they guessed wrong, and instead of correcting it, they rewrote it." He turned to Marla. "I'm not asking for an apology. I'm asking for accountability. He's still alive, but the law doesn't live either if the truth stays locked inside a camera." Marla tried to speak, but her words were lost as murmurs spread through the room. An older woman raised her hand. "I don't know about the paperwork, but I saw that video. They didn't give any warning. That's the truth. She went down right in front of her own house." A younger man from across the aisle said louder, "If my wife got shoved like that, I wouldn't sit quiet either." What exactly is the HOA covering for? No one answered. No document moved fast enough to smother the voices rising in the room. No one shouted. They asked questions, and for the first time, the board had no answers ready. Marla stood, her hand trembling as she held the meeting summary. "We will conclude early to avoid further misunderstanding. All feedback will be documented and forwarded to the Personnel Oversight Committee." Tobias didn't stop them. He closed the laptop, returned to his seat, eyes sweeping over the faces still watching him. Jenna stood slowly, then left the room with him as if they had known this moment would come. What they didn't know was that a young resident sitting in the front row had live-streamed the entire video presentation to a local Facebook group, captioned with a line spreading faster than any official response. The HOA meeting was interrupted by the truth. The clip was trimmed down to show only the shove, Tobias's stare, and the line, "He's not dead, but the law isn't alive." As night fell over Maple Crest, streetlights lit the still damp walkways from a passing rain. But the phones inside the homes didn't rest. Shares, comments, and tags spread far beyond the neighborhood's boundaries. No one saw this as just the problem of 14B anymore. And for those who had stayed silent during past HOA decisions, something about this moment made them pause. Not out of fear, but because they recognized what Tobias never had to raise his voice to say sometimes. To bring the law back to life, all it takes is a video and someone who doesn't back down. Jenna Cruz hadn't expected that a single video clip capturing the moment she was shoved could become the center of social media in less than a day. Early the next morning, after the HOA meeting, the footage from Tobias's laptop was clipped, framed precisely on the second Jenna hit the stone step, with his voice cutting through every excuse like a blade. "He's not dead, but the law isn't alive." The clip was reposted on Platform X with the caption, "This isn't enforcement, this is assault," and the hashtag #Navy SEAL White. There was no campaign, no influencer guiding the outrage. Within hours, the hashtag appeared under hundreds of angry tweets, many tagging HSD directly, some even pulling old HOA statements from last year proudly touting their neighborhood safety control. That evening, a user named CoreyVet79 posted, "I was recovering from a spinal injury in 2021. The first person who helped me stand after getting out of the brace was Jenna." The tweet didn't need photos. Below, someone named Elise replied, "She used to work at the Georgia Veterans Rehab Center, right?" Another confirmed, "Yes, Jenna CRE. A combat recovery coach, helped dozens of us get back on our feet, and now, an HOA dragged her down in front of her husband." It didn't take much for people to recognize injustice. Comments flooded in like a broken dam. One person recalled how Jenna used to hold free outdoor sessions for veterans who didn't qualify for federal rehab programs. Someone else remembered her driving out to a remote area just to help a retired Marine relearn how to breathe and balance after a stroke when he had no family left. An old clip from 2022 resurfaced, showing Jenna in the sun, helping an elderly man take small steps on the grass. Her voice came through softly, "Take it slow, but every step says you're still here." That image, paired with her being yanked off her own lawn, left people stunned. Because the truth was simple, she wasn't a stranger. She had once been the one lifting them up. The question, "Who is she?" began showing up everywhere, but within hours the answer spread like a label that needed no defense. She was the one who helped dozens walk again. She was the wife pushed down by those calling themselves community protectors. She was a decent woman punished for daring to exist outside their mold. And most of all, she was the wife of a man who once swore to protect justice, even without wearing the uniform anymore. The hashtag #Justice for Jenna entered the top 5 trending topics within 24 hours. There was no campaign, no PR team, just thousands of people angry not over what happened to them, but over what they saw happen to someone who had once helped. Veteran forums reposted the story. Many changed their profile pictures to the word justice in white, set against green grass, like the very lawn where Jenna had been thrown down. Some shared the video with a single line, "She's someone's wife, she's someone's hero." Tobias made no comments. He posted nothing. He simply sent the documents he knew needed to reach the right places at the right time. But the community responded to him in the same way he had once responded on the battlefield, decisive, uncompromising, and without shouting. His silence was what made the public noise louder. And at the center was Jenna, the woman who never called for help, now being lifted by dozens of voices speaking for her, through a language of justice carried in every message. In a small online seminar on post-trauma recovery, a former military doctor stated plainly, "Jenna is not just a victim. She's the symbol of a larger question. Why are the people who once helped hold this society together so easily stepped on by those pretending to protect it?" That question didn't stay online. Legal groups began opening discussions on the limits of power held by organizations like HOAs and the enforcement units they outsource. Local news picked up the story. An independent television station requested permission to air the video during its morning segment with the subtitle, "Yesterday she helped me walk, today I'll help her stand." From one shove, a wave began to rise not with loud anger, but with quiet recognition. She was there for us. Now it is our turn to be there for her. An old video began circulating again on social media, not high in resolution, but the man in the dark military uniform was unmistakable, Tobias Cruz. The footage showed his retirement ceremony at Camp Lejeune nearly 10 years ago. During the medal presentation, Tobias didn't step up to the stage. He simply bowed his head to accept the certificate, then left the line, carrying a black silver-framed photo of his SEAL Team 7 unit. The person filming captured him standing behind the chairs, gripping the frame so tightly his fingers turned pale. He said nothing during the ceremony, but that silence, years later, became the one thing people couldn't look away from. The first to reshare the clip was a military account called Remy Vets. He wrote, "I was there at that retirement. Tobias didn't take any honors. Afterward, he told me one sentence, 'They're gone, but I'm still here.' I used to think that was survivor's guilt. Now I get it. Tobias never left the fight. It just changed shape." Below were hundreds of shares. Some recognized their old unit photo. Others confirmed hearing his name during operations in the Guatemalan jungle and Somalia. One account wrote, I owe him my life. Not kidding. Don't mess with Tobias's wife unless you're ready to lose your freedom. The moment peaked when a tactical expert broke down the wrist lock Tobias used in the viral video. The footage was slowed, reversed, cut frame by frame. The footwork shift, the baton torque, the wrist pinned at a precise 37-degree angle, not enough to break bone, but enough to short-circuit nerve response. The analyst commented, "That's SEAL technique. No injury, but instant neutralization. What's scarier, he modulated that grip by instinct. No rage, just training. Only someone with high-level conditioning could execute that clean." A few independent reporters quickly pulled up public military records and confirmed Tobias had served 18 years in the SEALs, with multiple missions not disclosed due to national security classification. While no exact operations were declassified, the roster of former teammates remained intact. At least 2 had received Silver Stars for campaigns in Fallujah and Mogadishu. One of them, named Tyler Ramos, messaged Tobias's legal team with just one line: "If you need a sworn statement, call me. He's not just a teammate. He's the reason I got to watch my son grow up." The media began pairing the word veteran with wrongly targeted. Beneath the articles, people shared the image of Tobias holding the framed photo at his retirement beside the frame of him locking the enforcer's arm in his front yard. Nearly a decade apart, yet his expression remained unchanged, eyes sharp, not angry, not retreating, only the kind of presence that silences a room. A line of white text on a black screen spread quickly across sharing platforms. "They picked the wrong man. He survived Mogadishu, and you shoved his wife for watering plant." The caption hit like a slap to the face of the system, a direct blow to how the HOA, originally created to manage communities, had turned into a smug instrument, behaving as if law was a privilege reserved for the powerful. But this time, they picked the wrong target. Not because Tobias was a Navy SEAL, but because he had nothing to prove. Their actions had said everything for him. Marla Griggs, the HOA spokesperson, began facing intense public backlash. Old clips from the previous meeting resurfaced, where she said, "We believe the HSD officers acted appropriately," followed by the footage of Jenna being shoved, with Tobias seated beside her in silence. Her words were now paired with comments like, "She believes they did the right thing? Let's see if she still believes that when Tobias drops the HOA's shady funding records." Once again, Tobias's silence became the most unsettling thing. Because everyone understood when he wasn't speaking, it meant everything had already been prepared beyond words. A short segment on a military podcast opened with, "Imagine a man who survived the kill zones of Mogadishu, made it back when his team didn't, and stayed silent for a decade. Now, his wife gets dragged down by something called HOA enforcement, and while the internet explodes, he still doesn't speak. He just filed." Do you know what that means? It means he's already counterattacking, but this time, without a gun. In the quiet behind the flood of news and viral footage, Jenna looked at Tobias and asked, "How far are you going to take this?" Tobias answered softly, "Far enough that no one ever thinks they can lay a hand on you and hide behind a list of internal bylaws." It wasn't a threat, it was a certainty. And that made it more unsettling than any threat, because anyone who knew Tobias understood one thing clearly: he never said anything twice. 2 days after the shortened meeting, a new post appeared on the HOA's homepage. Authored under Marla Griggs and the representative PR team, the article was titled, "Clarification, Enforcement and Safety Protocols." Its opening line shaped the narrative. The resident failed to comply with landscape regulations, resulting in a misunderstanding that prompted an excessive but necessary response from enforcement staff. The article never mentioned Jenna by name. No apology. No admission of the shove. Instead, the language was carefully constructed, painting every action as an unfortunate circumstance. Beneath the article were moderated comments, most expressing sympathy for the stress placed on civil enforcement personnel. Online users quickly spotted the post as part of a coordinated effort. A data monitoring account pointed out that the article, along with near-identical versions, appeared on 3 platforms: a local news blog, another HOA affiliate site, and a verified X account, all published between 7 and 7:15 a.m., with matching text and links to the HOA's official site. It was a calculated media rollout. Behind it was a firm called Waterline Strategies, contracted by the HOA to manage community-level crisis communication. Tobias didn't issue a rebuttal. He didn't appear in the press. He offered no emotional response or new video. Instead, he sent 3 separate emails to 3 major publications: The Courier, Lexington Sentinel, and Veterans Weekly. Each email included 3 attachments: the contract between the HOA and HS, enforcement, the original landscape zoning map signed by the county office, and a screen capture from the surveillance footage showing the incident that occurred within private property boundaries. No commentary, no quotes, just documentation. Soon after, A journalist from the Lexington Sentinel published an article with the simple headline, "Maps Don't Lie." The piece opened with, "When rules are used to shield overreach, most people respond with excuses. Tobias didn't. He used document. And when a Navy SEAL uses silence to expose violence, you should understand he's not doing it to win, he's doing it to warn." That quote was shared thousands of times. Many began changing their profile pictures to Tobias in uniform, or walking through his gate with empty hands carrying nothing but a sealed folder. Another image spread even faster. Tobias standing in front of his wooden gate, the wall behind him marked with a bold message, "This is a line." No one knew exactly who painted it. Some said it was Jenna, others claimed it was a veteran from another state. But once the image was shared with the caption, "A man with no weapon, a man who says nothing, a man standing at his door," and the whole system flinches, all other interpretations faded. The symbol stood on its own. HOA tried to pivot. An anonymous representative told a small news outlet, "We cannot be responsible for how media platforms distribute clipped footage." But the public no longer waited for explanations. One Reddit post quickly rose to the top. "I used to work in crisis communications. Let me be clear, if the one being discredited is a SEAL, and he's not reacting with outrage, your agency needs to reevaluate everything." The post received over 40,000 upvotes in 6 hours. Meanwhile, a podcast called Every Civil Right featured a special guest, a lawyer who once served as legal counsel to the Department of Veterans Affairs. She said only one line, "Never assume he's quiet because he lacks evidence. He simply doesn't need to speak. Because when the system starts speaking for him, you'll have nowhere left to retreat." Tobias still didn't appear. He stayed home, cared for Jenna, answered a few emails from the legal team, and uploaded more scanned documents via Dropbox for the volunteer attorneys. In an interview with The Courier, Jenna said simply, "He used to carry weapons. He used to command. Now he just stands still. But he's never lost the ability to damage a system in the one way it fears most with proof." That quote became the next viral caption. A Twitter account known for quote images posted a photo of Tobias at his front gate with a new tagline, "Power isn't in what you say, it's in making others change without saying a word." The HOA's media agency began losing control of the narrative. A leaked internal email revealed that the PR team advised a temporary suspension of public statements because every response was being turned into a backlash punchline. One media staffer had handwritten a note on the margin of the report, "You can't win against a man who learned silence in war." By the weekend, a nearby resident placed a small sign on Jenna's fence, "This is the boundary. Beyond it is our limit." The HOA removed it, but not before a photo of the sign became a meme. One veteran commented, "My whole life, I thought the line was between life and death. Now I think it's between who gets knocked down and who stands up for them." The image of Tobias standing at his gate, his shadow stretching long across the brick path, began appearing at peaceful rallies in other states. In Texas, someone painted the scene in acrylic on the side of an old cafe. In Colorado, a group of students built a wooden model of Tobias's home to recreate the incident as a law school project. In New Jersey, a news station aired the footage of Tobias locking the enforcer's arm as a case study in appropriate reactive force during civilian emergencies. In media coverage, Tobias was called the man who drew a boundary with silence. But for Jenna, it all started on the lawn. "We were just watering the plants," she said, "and they thought they had the right to shove me because I watered too close to the line." A simple sentence, but the beginning of a chain reaction from abuse of power to the unshakable resolve of a man who had survived war. Tobias hadn't struck back. He had only drawn a boundary, and sometimes, simply standing still is what makes others move. Not forward but back, to reconsider, and to realize that some lines cannot be crossed without a cost. On a bleak midweek morning, Lyle Benson, a member of the HOA board who had remained silent in every previous meeting, unexpectedly sent an internal email titled, "Proposal to Reevaluate Security Enforcement Contract." The content was simple but weighty. "I propose a temporary suspension of all HSD activity in the Willowbrook area until an independent investigation is completed. Continuing this contract under current conditions may expose the entire HOA board to civil and criminal liability." There was no challenge in tone, no command, just calm, deliberate language that landed like a weight dropped into already boiling waters. Lyle wasn't known for making noise. He had been a high school teacher, served for years managing public school budgets, and was elected to the board for his calm, approachable demeanor. But the email, though not public, was quickly leaked to an internal forum. It didn't trigger debate, it triggered silence. A silence heavy enough to signal that cracks were forming inside the board itself, which had long projected a united front against what it called community agitation. Less than 2 hours after the email was sent, Lyle's access to the HOA HOA internal data system was revoked. When he attempted to log in to view previous meeting records, a message appeared. User lacks sufficient access privileges. He called support. No one answered. 30 minutes later, another email was sent from Marla Griggs's personal address HOA president to the full board, excluding Lyle. The opening line was clear enough to be a dare. We don't need skeptics right now. HSDD is part of a community safety strategy approved last year. Anyone who feels at risk should re-examine their own responsibilities. And Benson, in case you forgot, I still control the budget. In a civil body built on trust and consensus, revoking someone's access simply for raising concerns was an unprecedented act. The story didn't end there. A former HOA IT specialist confirmed that administrative access to the internal system had originally been shared among 3 board members, but after a restructuring earlier this year proposed by Marla, that access was consolidated into a single group under her direct control. This meant that every vote, every file, every meeting log could be edited or concealed from dissenting members. What Lyle had uncovered wasn't a sign of overreach, it was proof that the system had been functioning as an authoritarian structure. In a private message to Tobias, Lyle wrote, "I used to think silence was how I stayed neutral, but after this week, I realize silence is a form of complicity." Tobias didn't respond immediately. He simply forwarded the message to his attorney. A few hours later, a post appeared on the local veterans group platform, showing a screenshot of Lyle's statement. The caption read, "Even the gatekeeper wants out, so who's holding the key?" That question spread farther than expected. Other HOA members, those who had remained quiet until now, began sending discreet messages to one another. Someone messaged Jenna directly, "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." Another sent an anonymous email to the Lexington Sentinel, leaking a meeting record from 3 months ago, in which Marla had proposed expanding HSD's enforcement authority to adjacent corridors regardless of ownership. The story was no longer just about Jenna being shoved. It had grown into a confrontation between 2 systems. On one side, residents who wanted a neighborhood governed by transparent laws. On the other, a small group using rules as cover for personal authority. And Lyle Benson, the man who had stayed silent through every prior meeting, had now become the first critical link trying to detach from that apparatus. Not out of fear, but because it was time to ask a more urgent question: who is really operating this system, and for what purpose? Lyle Benson stood by the window of his small office, phone in hand, eyes fixed on the summer-worn trees in his front yard. He hesitated, then typed, and sent the message. "I can't speak out publicly, but I have some internal documents if you need them." The message reached Tobias near midnight, after several drafts typed and deleted. Lyle knew this step meant effectively removing himself from the power structure he'd once served. The reply was only one sentence, cold and direct, like people had come to expect from Tobias. "I need you to speak. Do not send files." "No. Oh, thank you. No persuasion, just a clear demand, almost a command." And it was that decisiveness that rattled Lyle. Those 4 words, "need you to speak," weighed heavier than any report he'd ever written. Inside the HOA board, tension had started to leak in thin streaks. A message thread between Marla Griggs and 2 close allies was leaked to the public, source unknown. The first line was chillingly blunt: "If we let that seal win, we lose power forever." Words like that, coming from a place meant to uphold neutrality and transparency, ignited the final blaze that burned through the last pretense. It spread rapidly across the Willowbrook Community Forum, where residents had long argued over yard care, street lighting, and maintenance fees. But this time, no one was talking about watering lines or paving stone. Marla's quote had become the center of everyone's fury. One resident wrote, "So that's the goal? Not safety? Not order, but keeping power?" Another commented, "She treats the HOA like her personal kingdom." Less than 3 hours after the message leaked, the phrase, "that seal," began appearing on front yard signs, but not in the way Marla had hoped. One family posted, "I stand with that seal." Another house wrote, "We're not afraid of power, we're afraid of silence." And gradually, a nameless movement began to form, not under a banner, but through handwritten signs hung outside homes, through the silent glances of residents walking past the HOA office. Tobias made no comment about the leaked message. He simply took a photo and sent it to his lawyer. Then he hosted a quiet conversation with neighbors right on his lawn, no cameras, no reporters, just a wooden table, a teapot, and a few folding chairs. He didn't talk about seals or Mogadishu. He talked about Jenna, about the swelling in her hand, about the look in her eyes that refused to let it become routine. An older woman asked, "Aren't you afraid?" Tobias shook his head. "Of course I am, but I've seen worse than fear. I've seen what happens when people know the truth and still pretend not to." No one clapped, but everyone stayed a little longer. They didn't need to hear more to understand that this time, no one could afford to stay on the sideline. As for Lyle, he printed a copy of the message, slipped it into a brown folder, wrote the senders and recipients' names in blue ink, then sent it by express mail to the Lexington sentinel. He didn't sign it or leave a return address, but in a small handwritten note, he wrote, "Ask them why they need to hold on to power against a man who just wanted to water the lawn with his wife." The next day, the front page headline read, "From Ho to Autocracy, When Power Becomes the Final Goal." And just beneath it was a photo of Jenna sitting on the front steps, her arm in a brace, eyes looking directly at the camera, not with blame, but with resolve. Under the faint light of an early autumn morning, Jenna sat quietly on the front porch, holding an envelope with no return address, the handwriting slanted but careful. Inside was a folded piece of paper, printed on old floral stationery from a local shop. The message was just a few lines. "I used to think you were causing trouble. I signed the petition to limit jogging hours because I thought it kept the neighborhood orderly. But now I see I've been silent for too long." No signature, just a small line at the bottom. Someone who used to stand on the sideline. Jenna read it 3 times, then closed the letter in her hand, slowly, as if she were holding something fragile but important. She didn't know who the woman was, or how many others had stayed quiet, fear of being named in a community that prized stability. But she understood one thing. The invisible wall had started to crack. Across town, at an annual veterans gathering, a handwritten letter drafted by a representative group was copied and signed. It wasn't addressed to Tobias or aimed at Marla Griggs. It was sent directly to the State Civil Council, which oversees local neighborhood association, though most of its duties revolve around trash complaints and sidewalk disputes. The letter stated plainly, "We didn't fight overseas for people at home to be shoved to the ground for watering a lawn." The wording wasn't elaborate, but its echo made people pause. A veteran who had served in Fallujah wrote beneath it, "If safety at home is guarded by someone in a vest marked HSD, and resistance is labeled disorder, then this country is confusing governance with control." The final letter carried 37 signatures, including 3 recipients of the Silver Star. What began in a quiet neighborhood was now spreading in ways no one predicted. The media no longer called it an HOA incident, but used phrases like abuse of authority and security under false pretense. A sociology expert interviewed in a magazine said, "What happened to Jenna is no longer personal. It reflects a system off course where someone becomes a threat not for doing wrong, but for refusing to bow." Meanwhile, Willowbrook residents posted a notice at the neighborhood gate. "We will hold an open community meeting with no HSD representatives." The bolded line, "Every resident has the right to speak," was underlined in red. Tobias didn't attend the meeting. He was in the backyard, repairing a wooden fence weathered by rain. Jenna came out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "A lot of people are writing to me, but maybe the biggest thing they're writing isn't on paper." Tobias looked toward the fence. "I know, we didn't choose to start this, but maybe it chose the right people." Jenna didn't answer. She simply lowered her head, picked up the garden shears, and returned to trimming the flowers along the walkway. The blooms hadn't all opened, but the winds had come, and the people who once stayed behind closed doors were now stepping out of the shadows holding letters, speaking up. This story no longer belonged to one person. It belonged to an entire community that once thought it was invisible, and that's exactly what made it unstoppable. A major newspaper in Virginia ran a headline that struck like a thunderclap. "Navy SEAL's wife assaulted by HOA enforcer? System to blame?" In less than 2 days, the article surpassed 2 million reads, outpacing even international news, forcing mainstream media to shift coverage. The title wasn't sensational, but the way it unpacked the relationship between HOA authority, unchecked enforcement, and Tobias's unique background made it impossible to stop reading. The journalist didn't focus on Jenna's tears or injuries, but instead drove into a core question. How can a civil system authorize a quasi-paramilitary force and give them the power to judge whether a resident's actions are compliant? The article quoted a clause from the contract between the Willowbrook HOA and HHSDSD force, stating that they were permitted to intervene in civilian behavior if there is an indication of impact on landscape safety. That clause, vague and full of loopholes, was what allowed shoving, commands with military undertones, all within a neighborhood marketed as the perfect place to raise children. A sociologist was quoted as saying, "When rules have no limits, even watering your lawn can become a trigger for suppression." Amid the growing backlash, several television networks requested interviews with Tobias, from morning shows to national segments. He declined them all. No exclusive interviews, no primetime slots, no public posts on social media. He sent just one sentence to the county courthouse, preparing to receive the civil suit. "This is no longer personal. This is a test for a community." The sentence had no emotion, no emphasis, no moral pitch, yet it was quoted verbatim on the evening news. A clear declaration that he wasn't standing up for revenge, but to publicly question the limits of authority and the silence of a community. Elsewhere, on a forum once known for tips on lawn care and landscaping, the article from the major paper was reposted, with a veteran user commenting, "We used to think discipline kept things tidy, but if that discipline turns into fear, no one will dare plant a single flower. The comment didn't rack up likes, but it was quoted in a closed-door HOA meeting in a neighboring neighborhood, a reminder that those watching Jenna and Tobias's story weren't just in the city, but across the state, and maybe farther. The unnamed conversation had begun. It didn't happen on television or at City Hall. It happened in the minds of residents who only wanted a peaceful place to live but were now forced to ask themselves, who controls that peace, and how do they intend to keep it? Tobias's silence, rather than calming the public wave, became a still point that let people see more clearly. This wasn't a clash between one resident and a self-appointed force. It was a bigger question about how a community chooses to manage power through fear or through dialogue. And when someone refuses to speak on air but sends a message straight to the court, it means he's chosen the latter. From that point on, this story no longer belonged to any one person. Under the light of a growing wave of outrage, a yellow envelope with a red seal from the Department of Justice was placed at the front door of the HOA office. Inside was an official summons addressed to 2 members of the HSD enforcement team who were present at the scene, along with the name of Marla Griggs, the highest-ranking official of the Willowbrook HOA board. The stated reason was brief but weighty: indication of violation of personal liberties. This was no longer an internal issue between residents and an organization. A civil system was now formally being questioned by a judicial authority. Jenna's name wasn't mentioned in the summons, but the image of her being shoved and the cold stare of Tobias had already become the backdrop to an investigation of far broader scope. Once the news was confirmed, the HOA sent out a general notice to all residents stating, "The regularly scheduled community meeting will be postponed until further notice." There was no apology, no explanation, just a mechanical closing line. "We are committed to maintaining stability during the information review process." But what residents now wanted was no longer stability, but transparency. In a chain of internal emails that was later leaked, it was Marla herself who ordered the community forum comments locked and instructed all HOA members not to speak without my approval. Her tone was clear in the email. "We need to control the narrative. No one is to say anything that could lead to further misunderstanding or misrepresentation." One resident working in law commented, "When someone tries to control speech before a hearing even begins, it means they're afraid of the truth." From Tobias's side, no statement was made. He offered no comment, posted nothing, and didn't appear in the media. But an image of Jenna accompanying him to the rehabilitation hospital where she used to be a trainer for veterans was shared by a young nurse with the caption, "They walked in, didn't speak loudly, but everyone stood to make way." There was no political message, no signs, no shocking quotes. And it was precisely that quiet presence that drew more public attention to the reason behind the summons. There had to be enough real evidence for a civilian force to be ordered to appear in court. Inside the HOA, the cracks were becoming more visible. Several board members not involved in the incident but still lumped in with the responsibility began expressing discontent. An administrative secretary resigned within the week, leaving a simple note on the desk: "I thought we were building a community, not a fortress." The note wasn't long, but many took photos and shared it as a symbol of the exhaustion felt toward how a local organization was trying to bend reality instead of facing it. The media began shifting focus from describing the act of misconduct to analyzing the relationship between the HOA and the HSD, enforcement team, operating budgets, contract terms, internal oversight procedures, all became open questions. A local investigative program cited the HOA's tax filings and revealed that the security fund accounted for nearly 38% of the operating budget, yet no detailed report had been made public to residents for the past 3 years. A former municipal auditor said bluntly on air, "The danger isn't in the armed force, it's in the unchecked budget lines." The first summons had triggered a new process, and if a hearing were to be held, Tobias wouldn't need to say a word. The records, footage, and what Jenna went through had already become the most compelling testimony for what the community was beginning to call by its real name: abuse of power. When an organization created to uphold order chooses violence as its method, the silence of the one who is pushed becomes more than personal, it becomes the harshest accusation. Tobias didn't appear in court, nor did he ask his attorney to hold a press conference. He mailed a copy of the civil complaint along with supporting documents, screenshots from resident-recorded video, clearly marking the exact second the HSD enforcer's arm shoved Jenna's shoulder, and a short medical statement detailing the angle of her fall and downward force, causing bruising under the skin of her left wrist and abrasions around the elbow. New emotional tone, new personnel commentary. Everything was presented like a soldier writing a mission report, documenting every detail of an undisclosed operation. The civil clerk who received the file wrote in an internal note, "Not a single single word expresses anger, but the formatting feels like every comma could become evidence. A local legal journal rarely read saw a spike in traffic after publishing an analysis titled, "The Seal Doesn't Punch Back, He Uses Structure and Patience." Oh, the article described how Tobias avoided reacting emotionally at the scene, followed through with steps so methodical they resembled the start of a long-range trace operation. The author, a former military prosecutor, explained, "He knows a personal reaction gets dismissed as emotional, but a reaction based on structure, documentation, and timing forces the entire system to respond." On social media, the quote was excerpted and circulated like a rallying cry. Not everyone who's silent is weak. Some go quiet to chart the attack. Marla Griggs, who had once controlled every word spoken on behalf of the HOA, suddenly canceled her meetings with legal counsel. She was not seen at the office for the next 3 days. Her auto-reply emails simply stated, "Out temporarily for health reasons." But internally, several administrative staff began to suspect she was trying to avoid facing the coming scrutiny. In a private resident group, one member shared, "We don't need Mrs. Griggs to apologize. We just want her to stand in front of us and re-watch that video through the eyes of a mother." Meanwhile, Jenna continued her physical therapy sessions, this time with someone who had once learned from her, a veteran who had lost his left leg. A photo of the two walking side by side in the rehabilitation center courtyard was captured by a passing photographer and published in a public health magazine with a single caption, "She once helped others stand. Now it's their turn." The image wasn't just widely shared, it was displayed in the main lobby of the hospital where Jenna used to work. It carried no slogan, no name, but everyone understood that those who had dismissed the initial shove were now witnessing its ripple effects not just on the body, but across the heart of an entire community. Tobias didn't use his voice to demand justice, but it was the discipline of his silence that made people start to ask a different question. Why did it take a retired soldier to force a local organization to uphold basic ethics? A comment in a national paper summed up what many were feeling. He didn't just protect his wife, he made the system ask why its foundation was ever laid wrong. When structure is used to hide wrongdoing, it must be structure rebuilt with evidence, witnesses, and timely questions that makes truth stand up again. And Tobias chose that path not to win, but to prove to the bystanders that justice doesn't need slogans. Justice only needs people who refuse to back down when they know they're right. The district court hadn't officially opened, but movement had already begun inside. The small hearing room, with 2 rows of wooden benches lining the central aisle, was dimly lit as usual before a preliminary hearing. Jenna entered earlier than the summons time, not out of habit, but as if seeking a moment of stillness to face something she'd never named aloud. Her right hand remained bandaged, gauze pressed gently around her wrist to reduce friction. The bruising had faded, but the ache still flared with each shift in position. She didn't take a seat. She stood at the witness table, eyes fixed on the judge's chair. Her gaze didn't waver for 30 seconds, no deep breaths, no sound of shoes on tile. It was silence not meant to suppress emotion, but to assert one truth. If her life had once been knocked down by a single shove, this would be the place where she refused to take even half a step back. When the back door swung open in a gust of wind, Jenna turned and walked out, saying nothing, looking at no one, leaving behind not a confrontation, but a presence. Out in the hallway, Tobias sat on a wooden waiting bench. The wall behind him was plastered with posters outlining court rules, fluorescent lighting casting his shadow long across the polished concrete. A guard walked over, didn't ask his name, just tilted his head. "You ready?" Tobias didn't look up. He answered flatly, without trying to sound impressive, "I was ready at the gates of Fallujah. This room's easier." The reply wasn't meant to diminish the court, it was a reminder of the context he had survived. Fallujah, once the fiercest combat zone, where people didn't ask if you were ready but whether you were still alive. For Tobias, facing a civil hearing, however biased or pressured, could never bow him the way war once had. A few Willow Run residents were also present, scattered quietly along the hallway. Not speaking, just exchanging looks that held more than anything printed in the news. An elderly woman clutched a canvas bag bearing the slogan of the local parent association she'd once signed the petition against Jenna's after-hours training. Today, she came alone. No slogans, no signs, no cameras. In the prosecutor's prep office, the hearing materials were laid out in order. Video footage from multiple angles, medical statements, sworn witness reports, all notarized and indexed. Notably, there were no subjective statements from Tobias, no recorded retelling in his voice, no emphasis on pain, only facts, what the camera captured, what the records documented, what the system would now have to match. A legal intern on their first civil case muttered, "Never seen a file this complete that still feels cold." The lead attorney replied softly, "Because he doesn't need to persuade, He just needs the system to function. Morning in Willow Run passed in silence. A few homes flew flags at half-mast, citing community security not yet ensured. But at house number 142, where it all began, Jenna reset the irrigation system with her left hand, despite the pain. Tobias stepped out afterward, saying nothing, simply reattaching the security camera, its lens aimed directly at the stone path where she had fallen. They didn't speak of the hearing or discuss the verdict. They tended to the yard as if the only way to keep their hearts intact was to care for what had once been violated. At court, the HOA's attorneys requested a delay in the official session due to key personnel absent without explanation. The prosecution did not object. Tobias's expression didn't change when he heard it. He left the courthouse around noon, walking past those who had once been neighbors, once skeptical, once indifferent. Some nodded, some looked down. He didn't respond. What he needed wasn't approval. It was a system capable of bowing to the truth, and that part had only just begun. On the final afternoon before the hearing, the wind arrived earlier than usual, the sun vanishing quickly behind trees bent from June heat. On the courthouse steps, Tobias had just stepped out from a brief meeting when he saw Lyle Benson, the man stripped of HOA system access, waiting. No blazer, no ID badge, no lengthy greeting. He walked up, held out a matte black USB, and said firmly, "I've changed my mind. I'll sign my name." Tobias didn't ask why, didn't question his motives, just nodded and said, "You just earned back your place as a resident." There was no handshake, no witness to the moment, but its weight lay in the lack of words. Lyle had once stood in the middle, had stayed silent out of fear of consequence, and had hesitated when Tobias asked him to speak up. But now he has chosen a specific act, and in this context, a promise to sign a name was a clear declaration of where he now stood. That night, Willow Run was no longer as restless as in the weeks before, but the silence wasn't avoidance anymore. It was the kind of quiet people keep when they stop arguing to await something clearer than words. At the entrance to the HOA office once, the site of interrupted meetings, once the origin of evasive statements, a wooden sign had been placed. No one claimed to have left it. No security footage showed who brought it, but by early morning, everyone saw it standing upright, neatly positioned, facing the glass door that had once reflected Marla Griggs reading official statement. On the sign was a hand-painted message, bold white on deep oak. "You don't need power to do what's right. You just need to know who was pushed." No logo, no signature. The sign didn't name Jenna or mention the HOA, but everyone living there understood. And precisely because it didn't call out anyone by name, the message hit harder, wider, sharper, truer. Those who had once stayed seated while Jenna lay on the steps, who had dismissed the video as unrelated to them, were now forced to see that line every time they came and went. It didn't accuse, but it is no longer allowed to forget. And in a community once controlled by administrative power, a single handwritten sentence became a symbol no one could take down. Tobias said nothing about the sign. He just looked at it for a few seconds while walking his bike past, then kept moving toward the courthouse where the truth was about to come to light, not through shouting, but through those who, at last, chose to stand on the side of what's right. The courtroom that day wasn't packed like a criminal trial, but everyone inside sat upright. The soft amber light from the ceiling reflected off the dark-stained wooden benches, giving the space a clear sense of seriousness, even before the gavel struck. Jenna stood facing the HOA's legal representative, her hand resting on the testimony stand, her wrist still wrapped in white gauze. When the attorney asked the final question, "What do you hope to get from this case?" she didn't glance at her husband, didn't scan the room, didn't tremble. She answered clearly, "I want the truth. No reports, no excuses." Across the aisle, the HOA's legal rep turned toward Marla Griggs. Marla adjusted her scarf, leaned into the microphone, voice steady with forced professionalism. "We deeply regret the incident, and, if any harm was caused, that was never our intention." Jenna didn't flinch, but her eyes locked onto the woman across from her and didn't move. Right after that, the screen behind the judge flickered on. A resident's video, the clearest and widest angle, played publicly. Each frame slowed down. The enforcer is blocking the water. Jenna is being pulled backward, losing balance. Tobias stepped out of the house, eyes fixed. The audio, though filtered, still caught the thud of her body against the stone step and someone yelling across the street. One HOA board member lowered her eyes when the clip of Jenna bracing her fall replayed. Two HSD legal reps shifted uncomfortably. Only Marla sat upright. But her posture no longer held control, it was taut. She stared at the screen, hands clenched, and finally said, "We didn't mean to hurt anyone." No one directly challenged the words, but no one acknowledged them with silence either. The judge didn't interrupt, simply nodded to proceed. Tobias didn't speak that day. He sat in the back, watching Jenna, eyes unwavering. A short while later, Jenna's attorney requested to play one more clip, an independent forensic analysis of the push. The animation showed arm movement, angle of impact, force, and the conclusion. The action cannot be classified as a defensive reflex. This was a deliberate push with clear risk of harm. When the clip ended, no one said a word. They didn't need to. In that room, what Jenna had asked for was now present. Evidence, comparison, a frame by frame that stripped away every vague explanation previously offered. She didn't ask for a favorable ruling. She didn't seek large compensation. What she wanted was acknowledgement not in legal language, but in the way those who once defended the system would now have to look at themselves. And the moment one board member lowered their head, Marla's words, not intentional, lost their weight. Because truth, when shown clearly and without edits, doesn't need to be shouted to become real. It only needs to be seen without turning away. And in that moment, the truth, though denied, rang loud enough that it could never be taken back. At the moment the hearing shifted into cross-examination, the atmosphere in the courtroom tightened like a steel cable. No one spoke, but every gaze from the back rows seemed to press all weight toward the HOA's table. Tobias's attorney stood up, carrying no papers, just lifting his head, voice low and clear. "Miss Griggs, I have only one question." He walked a few steps toward the opposing table, then stopped, eyes on Marla. "Do you stand by that push as a necessary action in the course of duty?" The question came without theatrics or emphasis, but the room stopped breathing. Marla didn't look at anyone, her eyes fixed on the untouched glass of water. 3 seconds, 6 seconds, 10. No one spoke. On the 12th second, a man seated behind her light blue shirt, name tag reading HSD Logistics Supervisor, answered instead. His voice was soft, slightly unsteady but clear. "I think we moved too fast. We misjudged the situation." The admission didn't come from the one being questioned, but it was enough to shift the axis of the entire hearing. A few whispers rose from the gallery, and no one silenced them. The judge nodded, wrote something down, then signaled to proceed. But the echo of that answer lingered longer than any formal charge in the record. No one objected, no one defended. It wasn't an apology, but it was the first crack in the hard shell the HOA had built. And Jenna, still standing at the witness stand, didn't show any trace of victory. She just nodded slightly, as if she had known this moment would come not by argument, but by waiting for the right time. That afternoon, local media outlets and social networks reposted Jenna's quote from her testimony. "I didn't shout for justice. I waited for them to admit it." The line didn't just headline the news, it was printed onto banners and posted outside the HOA office. No outrage in tone, no challenge, just a reminder. In a time when community organizations are increasingly questioned about power and transparency, words like these resonate deeper than declarations. And Jenna's calm in choosing when to stay silent, when to face forward, made this case more than a single lawsuit. It became a point of impact where people had to ask themselves, what have we been staying silent about? And did it really take a woman getting shoved for watering her plants to force us to see justice through the right lens? The boundary map data was brought to the courtroom on Tuesday morning, presented by an independent surveyor whose voice carried no emotion. The measurements appeared clearly on screen. The spot where Jenna was standing while watering plants lay fully within the private property legally owned by her and her husband, as recorded in the deed and the original zoning file from over a decade ago. The engineer pointed to the green border and zoomed in meter by meter. This is private land, not part of the shared landscape. There is no legal basis for enforcement in this context. One of the HOA's attorneys sat still, hands clenched, neither objecting nor asking questions. The court admitted the evidence as an irreversible confirmation the action taken against Jenna had no legal foundation. While attention remained on the map, Tobias switched to the second screen, which displayed internal documents provided by Lyle Benson. Among them was an email from 2 years prior, referencing a similar incident where an HSD officer was accused of misconduct against an elderly man in a wheelchair for pausing too long under a shared housing awning. An internal warning had been issued by a supervisory member, but nothing was ever reported to the residents. A note in the margins showed that Marla Griggs signed off on withholding the information to avoid unnecessary public reaction. Each line, each timestamp, appeared like heavy footprints of a system that had long chosen silence by default. No one needed to speak further. Jenna sat in the back row, her hands still bandaged but no longer clenched. Her face showed neither joy nor severity, only the calm of someone who had foreseen this outcome long ago. Tobias glanced at Lyle and gave a slight nod. The man who once stayed quiet now sat upright, his gaze fixed on the screen, a quiet act of restitution. In the gallery, one resident quietly recorded the presentation. The video would later circulate online with the caption, "When evidence is strong enough, silence becomes its own verdict." After the document reveal, the courtroom fell into a subdued stillness, not tense, but heavy with the weight of truth exposed. No one argued, and no one denied it. Beneath the quiet was unmistakable movement, trust beginning to shift, rules being pulled back toward their rightful purpose. And though Jenna never demanded punishment, every eye now rested on the same question: how many actions had been buried before, and how much longer until those wronged were finally believed? In that moment, every excuse became unnecessary. Truth didn't need to be loud to carry weight. It only needed a clear map, an impartial engineer, and one man who once stayed silent, choosing to claim his place in the community. On a quiet weekday morning, during the second hearing, there were no heated arguments, no loud objections, no sharp accusations. Only the soft rustle of papers and scattered footsteps echoed in the courtroom, where every key figure had appeared and all evidence had been presented. A court clerk turned to Tobias, voice low but clear enough for those nearby. "Do you wish to testify?" Tobias looked up, gaze steady. "No," he replied simply. Everything that needed to be said they already said themselves. His answer wasn't a refusal of responsibility, but a choice: to let the system reflect on what it had done, so no one could blame an outsider when the truth had already been spoken by their own. And when words are no longer weapons, silence can be the final blow. Just when everything seemed to be nearing its end, a quiet but powerful moment unfolded. Only one person remained standing in the courtroom: Jenna. Her hand still wrapped in bandages, her frame small in the wide space, but her presence made the room hold its breath. She didn't need further defense, didn't need a lawyer or ally. She stepped forward at the court's request, stood at the witness stand, and turned to face Marla Griggs. Her look wasn't angry, wasn't pleading, and carried no intent to shame. It was simply unflinching. Jenna stood as the final witness who didn't need to speak. Everyone in the room saw it clearly. Direct confrontation was the one thing Marla had never prepared for. Marla sat at the HOA council's table, shoulders slightly pulled back, eyes moving slowly, fingers fiddling with the hearing transcript but unable to read a line. The woman who once signed every decision, dismissed every complaint, now had no firm tone to lean on. In front of her stood the woman once shoved to the ground, now standing without weapons, without rage, simply through unyielding presence. No one interrupted. The judge remained silent for several seconds before moving on to the next item. A resident seated in the last row scribbled a note in their notebook. "Words can be erased, a look cannot. I." Days later, a photo of Jenna standing at the witness stand, facing Marla, spread online, shared with no caption except 3 bold words: "She stood still." There was no online argument, no questioning. People simply shared it as a symbol of something many don't dare to do: look directly at the one who caused them harm, not for revenge, but to affirm the pain existed, had witnesses, and left a mark. In a world of endless shouting matches, that stillness carried more weight than any speech, because it forced others to face themselves without a screen to hide behind. Jenna didn't ask for an apology, but her calm, unwavering gaze made every excuse fall away. And for Tobias, sitting silently in the back, that was the most complete victory, not of law, but of integrity. The court issued its preliminary ruling on a quiet morning, no fanfare, no outburst, just words spoken by the judge, transcribed in shorthand, and then spreading like fire through dry grass. Willow Ridge HOA was found to have violated civil rights under state law, using unauthorized force through a third-party entity known as HSD, a civilian security organization that was meant to support order, not enforce violence. The court emphasized the phrase, "through a third party," as a clear warning. No civil system has the right to avoid accountability by outsourcing it. More importantly, the deliberate concealment of internal evidence, including locking access to data and delaying fact-checking, was listed in the ruling as an act of manipulating community oversight. The words weren't loud or accusatory, but they carried enough weight to corner the entire HOA structure with no room left to retreat. That same afternoon, an official notice was sent to all Willow Ridge residents via the community email system. The contract between the HOA and HSD was terminated immediately, with no negotiation. The termination clause went beyond severing ties. It included an obligation to refund all enforcement-related fees collected from residents over the past 12 months, including the landscape violation fee Jenna had once been forced to pay. To outsiders, it was just a reimbursement. But to Tobias and Jenna, it was the system's first admission. Something wrong had happened, and this time, they weren't denying it. The ruling, however, went one step further, and it was this step that made residents stand and applaud at the emergency town hall 3 days later. The entire HOA board, including Marla Griggs, was ordered to give a public account of their actions at a special hearing, and was suspended from all decision-making authority for 90 days. During that period, a neutral oversight committee would handle administrative matters to ensure transparency. In practice, this meant their power had been revoked, not forever but long enough for those who had spoken up to finally hear answers, and for those who had stayed silent to ask themselves what they had allowed to happen. The public meeting saw neither Jenna speak nor Tobias take the floor. They sat in the second row, side by side, listening. A woman stepped up to the mic and asked, when she was pushed, why didn't anyone from the board check in on her? A man added, we elected you to manage, not to cover up. Marla remained still, hands clasped, offering no rebuttal. She knew words weren't enough anymore. What the organization had lost wasn't reputation, it was trust. And trust, once gone, cannot be reclaimed with statements. It can only be rebuilt through action. From hearing to ruling, from judgment to enforcement, the entire process unfolded without violence, no fists, no shouting for revenge. Just small steps, documented evidence, and steady gazes that never wavered. The system spoke not through grand statements, but through change. And what gave that change its weight was that it came from people once pushed to the margins, now stepping into the center on their own terms. They didn't break the law. They used it, not to deflect, but to clarify. And this time, the system had to bow. At the press conference after the preliminary ruling, Tobias didn't give a long speech. He simply walked up to the podium, looked directly at the row of reporters, and said, we don't want to dismantle the system. We want it to remember who it was built to protect. His voice wasn't loud, but each word landed like a line redrawn between order and abuse. Behind Tobias, a local resident held up a handmade sign, plain handwriting, no decoration, just bold black letters. Violence doesn't end with violence. It ends when someone holds the line. No one clapped, no one cheered, but every camera lens turned to that sign. It was the only answer needed. From that moment, Tobias's words and the sign behind him spread across community forums. People began printing it on shirts, posting it in windows, and in several neighborhoods, residents initiated reviews of the contracts between their HOAs and third-party security forces. There were no protests, no ultimatums, but each action carried the same truth. Those who had once stayed silent were now checking the boundaries of power, and those boundaries were no longer taken for granted. A few days later, a group of law students hosted a small seminar at the local library, using Jenna's case to examine residential ownership within quasi-public regulatory space. Technical terms that once felt abstract took on vivid meaning, backed by real images. A woman fallen on her front steps, and a man standing at the gate like a marker in the ground. Neither had asked to be seen as heroic, but their refusal to stay quiet forced the broader community to reconsider who gets protected and who must fight just to live right in a place labeled safe. On a veterans forum, the case became an example of restraint of a man who once held a weapon choosing stillness over force. One comment, widely shared, read, he used to carry a rifle, now he uses calm to leave no room for denial. The writer didn't sign their name, only Fallujah, 2006. Words like these didn't stir outrage, but they kept the story from fading. Each reader, whether they knew Jenna or Tobias or not, recognized something familiar, a porch, a doorstep, a right to stand still without being dragged away in the name of misplaced authority. After the press conference, Jenna declined all interviews. She posted only one photo to her personal account, the front lawn green again, the hose still in its original place, and a short caption, watering the land you're entitled to, and knowing why. Not much engagement, but those who had followed the story from the beginning understood. The outcome wasn't the point. What mattered was that they never abandoned the right way to act, even when cornered. The verdict, the sign, and Tobias's words didn't change all of America, but they left behind a reminder with weight. The system is just an empty structure if it forgets who it was built to serve. And the boundary Tobias spoke of wasn't a painted line on the ground, it was the limit we place on ourselves to stop order from becoming a justification for harm. The story didn't end in victory or defeat. It ended in something many had stopped believing was possible, a community that paused, looked inward, and chose to make it right. 1 week after the press conference, after the words had faded but their echo still quietly filled the neighborhood, Jenna Cruz returned to her familiar running path, the same path where she had once been forced to the ground by those acting in the name of community standards. She didn't carry a hose, didn't bring anything with her, and didn't walk with Tobias. Just herself, in a gray shirt and simple workout pants, moving slowly along the sidewalk that curved around the neighborhood. The grass had been neatly trimmed, and the community landscape area signs were replaced this time with clear boundary maps. But Jenna didn't stop at any of them. She walked past, eyes forward, as if this walk wasn't about checking the scenery, but about affirming something far more important, the right to walk, after having been dragged down. A neighbor watched from behind a curtain. Another, washing his car, gave her a quiet nod when their eyes met. No one rushed to apologize, no one forced friendliness, but this silence didn't feel suspicious. It felt like recognition, a quiet respect given to someone who was hurt for standing up, and chose to return without changing how she stands. Near a bend by the old guard post, a girl of about 8 rode by on a bike, then circled back and stopped in front of Jenna. She looked up, hair in 2 side ties, white sneakers dusted with dirt. "Are you better now?" she asked. locked, clear and steady in the morning air. Jenna leaned down, smiled, and gently touched her right wrist where the bruise had faded and the bandage was gone, then said, "Yes, my wrist and my trust." The girl didn't fully grasp the meaning, but nodded anyway, then pedaled off, her wheels clicking over the clean brick path. From across the street, another woman approached slowly, Mrs. Linda, who once supported tighter control in the neighborhood. They didn't speak, just passed each other, but Linda's eyes softened for a moment, like someone realizing the boundary she once defended wasn't about safety, but exclusion. Jenna said nothing and didn't slow, but the steady rhythm of her steps made everyone walking the other way look up. She didn't need to win a case to change the neighborhood. Her calm return, in a place that once turned cold, was already the strongest proof justice doesn't live only in a verdict. At the end of the route, Jenna stopped in front of a newly painted white wall. On it was a small line of text, unclear who had written it. If someone was ever pushed down here, this is where they should walk first. There was no signature, no emblem, but Jenna touched the words lightly, then turned and began walking back the other way. Her steps weren't long, but they were steady enough to feel the ground beneath her feet. On the street where harm had once begun, she now continued not out of caution, but by choice. And as she passed the bend that led home, Jenna didn't look back. She didn't need to. What needed facing had already been left behind, not erased, but seen clearly, and no longer able to control her path. Tobias sat on the stone bench near the gate, the one where he used to watch each morning before Jenna left the house, when things were still calm and neighbors' conversations revolved around trash pickup or tomorrow's weather. His hand rested lightly on his knee, eyes fixed on the line of trees where the tire marks from the SUV had once been. No one mentioned that vehicle anymore, but everyone knew that's where it started, not with a scuffle, but with cruelty dressed as enforcement. A veteran walked by, plain uniform, black cap, thin frock, but upright. He stopped in front of Tobias without question or explanation. He gave a sharp, deliberate salute long enough that it couldn't be dismissed. Tobias returned it, not with words, just a steady nod and a gaze that didn't shift, as if quietly affirming that real respect isn't tied to rank, but to how someone lives through the wounds and still chooses to stand straight among those who once turned away. The afternoon air was still, but along the neighborhood walkway, people began to linger longer in front of the community bulletin board. The old plywood panel had been replaced with a clear glass surface, and behind it was a clean white backing. Every old notice had been removed, even the 4-page watering guideline that once forced Jenna to print 3 comparison copies. In the center, a handwritten message was neatly posted. As of today, watering your front yard doesn't need a permit, just respect. No name, no stamp, but the handwriting was bold and deliberate, not from an office, but from someone who understood exactly why it needed to be written. An elderly woman passed by, paused longer than usual, then slowly nodded before walking on. A boy snapped a photo and sent it somewhere, then smiled faintly. No one broke the quiet, but it was clear. In those few words was a closing note for something that never should have happened. Jenna came home and found Tobias still sitting there. She didn't ask anything, just placed a hand on his shoulder as she passed, and he didn't turn around. Between them, no words were needed, because the silence now was no longer a burden. It was the peace they had earned through uncompromising patience. Behind them, the neighborhood carried on. Someone was watering their front yard, not glancing sideways, not pausing mid-motion. Someone else walked a dog past, eyes looking elsewhere, but footsteps lighter than usual. Nothing had changed dramatically, but in each small gesture, change had happened. And in the shade of the day's end, Tobias lifted his head and took a deep breath, not to remember, but to make sure that from this point on, people wouldn't forget. Not his name, not any triumph, but the invisible line that had once been crossed, and how he redrew it. Not with fists, but by sitting upright in a neighborhood that once believed it could silence the kind of stillness that speaks the truth. The forum took place in a small hall, packed to capacity. A banner on a white cloth backdrop read, "Community Ethics After Litigation, Dialogue or Confrontation." Plastic chairs were neatly arranged, and attendees came from various neighborhoods, residents, HOA board members, and a few local journalists quietly taking notes. Jenna sat in the front row, Tobias next to her, his hand still intertwined with hers. She dressed simply, wearing only a cloth necklace, a gift Tobias had given her the day she completed her community rehab program. When invited to the podium, Jenna shook her head. The moderator raised an eyebrow. She stepped forward but didn't stand center stage. She said, "I'm not giving a speech. I'll just answer one question, if there is one." After a brief pause, a middle-aged woman raised her hand, someone who had signed the petition in support of the HOA months earlier, but then sat down, giving the mic to the moderator. The young man glanced at his notes, then looked up and asked plainly, "If you saw the person who pushed you again, what would you do?" Jenna lowered her gaze for a breath, then looked up, her eyes steady but unshowy. She answered, "Nothing. I don't need anyone to bow their head. I need them to stand up and understand why. The room went still, no nods, no applause. But some exchanged glances, others wrote her words down verbatim. Tobias didn't move, but his expression softened not out of relief, but in quiet agreement, as if her answer was exactly what he would have chosen himself, yet it was time for someone else to take the front. After that, Jenna returned to her seat. She said nothing more and wasn't asked again. The moderator understood and moved to the next topic. But from that point on, no one asked anything directly. They began questioning the system about reporting processes, about the boundary between authority and obligation, about the responsibility of those who hold rules not to let them become weapons. A representative from Eastside shared that their community had hired a service similar to HSD, and after seeing the video of Jenna being pushed, they had demanded a full review of their contract. Another attendee mentioned that following the case, they discovered opaque HOA fees and were preparing to file a petition. A high school teacher said the local civics curriculum had just been updated, now featuring an example drawn from the quiet resilience Jenna and Tobias displayed. The forum ended after 2 hours, without a conclusion, no rallying cry, but everyone left slowly. Many paused by the note-taking table, where a printed copy of Jenna's words had been quietly displayed, unadorned. A single plain line, clearly printed. I don't need anyone to bow their head. I need them to stand up and understand why. Someone had taped a handwritten note beside it. As for me, after hearing this, I also want to ask if I've been standing tall. That night, Jenna didn't go online, didn't check the news, didn't reread her messages. She sat beside Tobias on their front porch, the light from inside casting just enough glow for them to see each other's faces clearly. Tobias gently touched her wrist, where the bruise had once been now healed, though a faint mark remained. She asked softly, "Do you think they understand yet?" Tobias shook his head. "Some probably don't, but they seem to be starting to listen," Jenna smiled. And in the quiet night, the sound of the automatic sprinkler gently echoed from the front yard, steady, uninterrupted, with no one stepping in. This time, it wasn't just water. It was proof that a boundary once rebuilt with resolve would not be crossed again without reflection. A line from Jenna was shared widely across platforms. "One fall can push you to rise, but when a community falls, it takes many to lift it." The quote wasn't recorded on stage, not edited for media. It was from a personal audio clip captured by a resident sitting in the back row and shared on their private page. Within 2 days, it showed up in captions, reposts, and neighborhood group chats. Some rewrote it on whiteboards in classrooms, others printed and taped it to notice boards in apartment buildings. It wasn't about making Jenna a figurehead, it was about holding a mirror to those who once stood by while the line got blurred. What few expected, many of those who once backed the HOA and criticized Jenna for stirring up unnecessary tension began writing handwritten apologies. One was a neighbor 2 doors down who had signed in support of limiting morning jog hours, now writing in blue ink, "I thought rules helped keep order, but I forgot rules need people who understand what the right order means." Another, a former HOA admin, admitted in their letter, "I stayed silent when I learned HSD's contract had a liability waiver, thinking it was standard. Now I see silence costs far more." Each letter was signed, without attempts to hide. Some even brought theirs to Jenna's door, leaving them in unsealed envelopes as if to say they weren't asking for forgiveness, only to be seen. Jenna kept them all. She didn't respond, didn't post about them, didn't return a single one. She pinned each letter carefully on a small bulletin board set up on the porch, above a shelf holding her old watering can and a few worn garden gloves. Under each letter, she added a handwritten line. "Writing at the right time is action, but writing late and still writing, that's action too." Every morning, before tending the yard, Jenna paused briefly in front of that board, as if to remind herself that those who once turned away but now return don't need to be absolved, they need to be acknowledged, so no one ends up writing the same letter twice for the same mistake. One day, a group of social work students from a nearby university asked to interview Jenna not for a television program, but for research on community recovery after civil conflict. Jenna declined to give a long statement but agreed to meet. During their talk in the backyard, around a low wooden table and glasses of iced tea, she shared just 3 things. First, a community isn't held together by rules, it's held by how we treat the person who happens to brush against those rules. Second, recovery doesn't start with an apology. It starts when someone dares to walk again down the same path where they were once pushed. And third, if someone falls, don't rush to pull them up so they can move on. Sit beside them for a moment, because maybe what they need first isn't a hand but someone who stays. The students took careful notes, listened in silence, and didn't record video. They left as the sky turned, taping a thank you note on the gate where a warning once read, "Controlled area, no entry without authorization." That sign was gone now, replaced by a wooden plaque Tobias had carved himself. This is where something wrong once happened, and where people are now learning to make it right. That night, Tobias came home late. He sat down beside Jenna, the light from the house casting just enough glow to see each letter pinned on the the board. He asked, "You still adding more?" Jenna replied softly, "If more letters come, I'll keep pinning them." Tobias didn't say anything else. Wind slipped through the fence slats, carrying the sound of water trickling from the roadside planter. It was the kind of sound no one usually noticed, but it was that very normalcy they had fought for all along. The right to water a plant without being dragged down, the right to stand in front of your own home without having to prove you belonged, and more than that, the right to make things right without being banned from ever returning to the porch. One windless afternoon, while Jenna was gathering fallen oak leaves, a young girl from House 14 cautiously crossed the street, holding a tray of still warm cookies. She stopped at the gate, standing straight, her face a mix of determination and unease like someone carrying a task heavier than her age. Jenna set down the broom, stepped out to open the gate, and smiled. "Need any help, sweetheart?" The girl held out the tray, her voice small but steady. "My parents said they voted wrong before. Now they want me to learn what's right." Jenna looked into her clear, wide eyes too young to fully grasp the cruelty behind a vote, yet already beginning to carry its echo. She took the tray with both hands and nodded slowly. "Then you've started right." They sat together on the porch steps, the very spot where the first tear between Jenna and this community had appeared. One glass of cold water was poured, then another. The girl took a sip, glanced toward the garden, and hesitantly asked, "What's that white flower called?" Jenna turned to the blooms by the fence and answered, "That's jasmine. It blooms slowly this season, but when it does, it lingers." The girl nodded, then asked, "When's the best time to water them?" Jenna tilted her head and replied, "Early morning, when the soil's still damp and the sun's not harsh yet. Kind of like how we treat people do it when they need it, not just when we feel like it." Oh, they kept talking, never mention HSSSDD, the trial, or the names of those who had caused harm. To outsiders, it might have looked like nothing more than a middle-aged woman chatting with a neighborhood kid about the weather, soil, and garden rhythms. But in that ordinariness, an old crack was quietly being mended with something gentle and new, and a lesson was being passed not by lecturing, but simply by sitting together, looking in the same direction. When Jenna walked the girl home, the sunlight had tilted across the rooftops, washing the narrow road in gold. She paused by the fence, watched the child's slow steps disappear, then turned back inside, carefully cleaned up the 2 glasses, and wrapped the cookie tray in a cloth. Tobias came in from the backyard, saw the tray, and asked, "Who's that from?" Jenna replied, "From someone who never opposed us, but is helping those who did learn from the start." Tobias smiled, said nothing, and pulled up a chair beside his wife, his gaze resting on the porch step, the same place Jenna had once fallen when she was pushed. Now it was clean, dry, and more importantly, had once held the small shadow of someone learning how to ask, how to listen, and how to grow in the right direction. That night, Jenna wrote a few lines in her old notebook not to keep a record, but to remind herself, justice doesn't arrive in courtrooms. It arrives when a child asks when the right time is to water. Below that line, she made a soft mark, then added, "And when the one once blamed still has the patience to answer." The next day, a few neighbors walking past Jenna's house paused a little longer. They looked at the tray of cookies behind the glass, and noticed a note taped beneath it. "Big things start with how we handle small ones." No one knocked. No one took photos to share online. But that day, 3 residents quietly walked into the neighborhood management office to register a request to restart the monthly discussion sessions, with the first topic set as, how to begin again with your neighbors. What had happened to Jenna had grown far beyond a single injury, but what made people turn back wasn't the fall, it was how she stayed seated afterward. Like when she welcomed the little girl from House 14 not to prove she was right, but to restore belief in what's right. And in each scattered question about watering, sunlight, flowers, there was a quiet, persistent reminder. A community's boundaries aren't made of fences, but of the trust rebuilt after someone has been pushed down. One calm afternoon, with sunlight brushing across the fence, the girl sat close beside Jenna, her eyes still watching the white jasmine swaying gently in the wind. The air felt thick with an easy stillness. She held her cold glass of water, her hands trembling slightly, then asked, "When I grow up, can I break the rules if I think they're wrong?" Jenna rested her hand on her knee, looked into the distance, then turned to the girl and answered, soft but clear, "When you know what's right, you'll never have to break anything. Just hold steady. The rest will shift as it needs to." That answer wasn't a push toward rebellion, nor blind obedience. It was the distillation of lived truth where so-called rules had once knocked her down, but quiet persistence had helped her rise again. The girl looked at her hands and nodded silently. Then, as if remembering, she exhaled, set down her glass, and hugged the tray of leftover cookies. "I have to go now. My parents said not to stay out too long." Jenna smiled and nodded, walking her to the gate. The girl paused, hesitated, then added, "Thank you for not yelling at them when they hurt you." Jenna bent slightly, didn't answer right away. She just placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, gave it a gentle squeeze, and said, "I didn't need to shout. I just needed to remember I wasn't wrong." That moment wasn't caught on camera, wasn't streamed live, and no resident stood by to witness it, but it etched itself into a child's memory, a memory unrecorded but lasting, told again and again. Years later, when that girl became a teenager, then an adult casting votes, attending school meetings, or speaking truths others didn't want to hear, she would recall that moment as something that changed how she saw grown-ups. She would say that on that day, the woman didn't lecture, didn't hold up signs, didn't ask for support. She just sat down, listened, and answered with the calm of someone who knows that what is right doesn't need to be shouted, it only needs to be lived, day after day. That story later became the subject of the girl's college application essay. She wrote that she used to believe grown-ups wear rules like armor, but then realized some grown-ups don't need armor, they just need integrity. And from them, a new generation starts to learn how to keep laws from straying too far from morality. Jenna never knew where that essay ended up. She never asked the girl's full name, even after seeing her a few more times around the neighborhood. But each time she saw the girl quietly helping an older resident with their bags, or stopping a younger kid from stepping on a restricted flower bed, Jenna would simply smile, not because of the correct behavior, but because of the look in her eyes, steady, unflinching. The same look Jenna herself had held during the hearing, when facing the person who signed the order that led to her fall. That evening, Jenna opened her old notebook and added a line to the last page. Answering a child's question may not change the law, but it can change the way one person sees the world, and that's where laws should begin again. Out on the porch, Tobias leaned against the doorway, looking out at a street that no longer felt distant. He spoke quietly. "That girl reminds me of you." Jenna didn't turn. She set down her pen, closed the notebook, and replied, "Number, she'll be different, because she starts before ever being pushed." In the grand narratives about justice and systems, sometimes what shifts, everything doesn't happen in a courtroom or during a speech. It happens when one woman sits with one child and gives real answers to questions that seem small. And from there, a community doesn't just learn to apologize, it learns again how to face each other without bowing or looking away. That's not victory, that's rebuilding. 1 month after the final ruling was issued, a state-level veterans organization sent a letter proposing to honor Tobias with the Silent Service to Community Medal, citing, "He defended the dignity of a citizen in a way that made the entire system look at itself." That was the final line in the letter, handwritten in blue ink by the officer in charge of the honor roll. When invited to the veterans' headquarters to receive the award, Tobias went alone, didn't wear his uniform, didn't alert the press, and brought only the zoning map he once submitted to the court. The meeting took place in a small room behind the main office, lined with photos of old campaigns, fallen soldiers, and battles everyone there understood without needing to name them. One officer stood up, holding the medal box, and asked quietly, "Will you accept it?" Tobias paused for a moment, then replied, "If I accept, I'll have to give a speech. And what I wanted to say, I've already lived." The man didn't press him or try to persuade him. They just sat there, looking at a black and white photo of a long-ago platoon. In that space, no more words were needed. News of the declined award spread internally, then reached a few journalists. But no one published a formal piece, no one made it a headline. Maybe because everyone understood it wasn't an act of defiance, it was a choice. Tobias chose not to turn his family's pain into a symbol. He didn't want to be the face of resistance, nor a media example of justice won. For him, what needed to be done was done. Those who needed to speak had spoken. The rest was to silently carry out what still had to be finished. Still, in some other veteran communities, the image of Tobias standing quietly at his gate was printed, framed, and hung in meeting rooms. Below each photo was a small engraved line. He didn't shout, he stood. For many soldiers who had crossed the line between life and death, that stance meant more than posture. It stood for what the military calls bearing, the posture of dignity, not yelling from pain, not lashing out from offense, but standing as a principle carried from battlefield to suburb. One day, a group of cadets visited Tobias's home as part of a civil-military exchange program. They sat in a circle in the backyard, where Jenna once watered the garden, and asked, "If it happened again, how would you respond?" Tobias took a sip of water, set the glass down, and replied, "Same as before, but this time, I'll make sure others already know where the boundary starts." Another cadet asked, "Don't you feel angry, knowing how many people stayed silent in the face of injustice?" Tobias looked around, his gaze settling on the flower bed blooming with white blossoms. "Anger doesn't teach anyone, but endurance can make them teach themselves." Those words were never aired on television or featured in trending feeds, but every cadet who left that backyard wrote them down in their notebook. One later wrote in a personal journal, "I learned how to hold dignity not on the training field, battlefield, but in a small garden, where a soldier didn't need anger to make a community change. Jenna came across those lines in an anonymously shared essay. She said nothing, only slipped the card back into the notebook that once held the first photos filed with the court, next to the final line. Steadiness doesn't come from medals. It comes from not straying from what's right even when no one claps. A few days later, she and Tobias attended a veterans' memorial service. Tobias again declined to speak, but when the anthem played, he stood in the back, hand over his heart, back straight, eyes locked on the flag. A young boy beside him whispered to his mother, "Is that man someone important?" The mother replied softly, "Number, but he's someone important people will have to listen to." In a world where everyone demands to be seen, Tobias chose instead to help others see what was right. He never stepped onto a stage, but those who once tried to hide their wrongs were forced to step down. And in the quiet stance of a soldier who had survived Mogadishu, Fallujah, and a shove on his own front porch, remained a kind of victory too deep for headlines but engraved in the community's memory. And that was enough for a man not to be forgotten. A week after the memorial, Tobias received a handwritten letter from a man who once served with him on SEAL Team. The handwriting was strong, but slightly shaky, the mark of someone aged by time. "Thank you for not using a weapon this time, and still making people stand up." Tobias read it once, folded it, and showed it to no one. But from the look in his eyes, Jenna knew. Those words had struck the deepest part of him, not because they praised him, but because they came from someone who understood combat and who also knew that sometimes, not striking back is the highest form of courage. That same day, at the corner of the yard where Jenna had once been shoved, a new stone bench appeared. No fence, no plaque, no name. Just one line engraved on its surface. "You pushed the wrong woman." She didn't push back. She changed direction. Passersby paused. Some bowed their heads for a moment, some sat down briefly, some glanced and kept walking, but none denied it. That spot now held a shared memory, not of pain, but of a pivot from silence to resistance, from isolation to awakening. Jenna saw the bench on her morning walk. She didn't sit, she simply stood before it, placed a hand on the backrest, and nodded an unspoken greeting to the past that had passed, and to a lesson still unfolding. Under the soft early summer sun, those who once doubted her, who had voted in favor of banning front yard watering, who looked away when the video went viral, now quietly walked past the bench and left a few wildflowers underneath. No one organized it, no one announced it, but each week brought new signs, a handwritten note pinned to the community board. "If you see someone needing help, don't wait for HOA approval." An elderly neighbor who once opposed Jenna left a packet of seeds by her door. A young couple asked if they could join her in watering flowers along the sidewalk, not because they lacked an automatic system, but because they wanted to be there. Tobias appeared less often. He kept to his habit of sitting on the familiar wooden bench out front in the late afternoon, eyes following the narrow path connecting homes in the neighborhood. For him, the noise had passed, and what needed preserving now wasn't reputation or victory. Peace, real peace, not one enforced by policy, but one born of understanding and mutual respect. One time, seeing the neighbor's boy holding a shovel, about to plant near the property line, Tobias walked over and smiled. "If you need soil, I've got some extra on my side. But if you need the right to plant, then plant on yours. Just make it so beautiful that no one dares to pull it up." That quote was later shared on community forums not as a video or image, but as a retelling. For many, it lingered as a reminder. Sometimes the best way to protect a boundary is to turn it into something no one wants to destroy. In the days that followed, the local high school launched a unit on civic ethics, using Jenna's case as part of the curriculum. 11th grade students were assigned an essay on an action that changed the behavior of a whole neighborhood. Some wrote about the video, some about Tobias's silence, but most wrote about the stone bench where, as one student put it, "Every time someone sits there, I want to ask, if I got pushed down right here, would I be strong enough to stand back up and make others reflect like she did?" At night, when the wind calmed and porch lights dimmed, Jenna stepped out onto the porch and looked down the slope where wildflowers grew in a neat row. She placed a hand on Tobias's shoulder as he read, then sat beside him. No words were spoken. A stray cat wandered by, propped a paw on the bench, rubbed against Jenna's leg, then curled into her lap as if seeking shelter. Tobias chuckled and whispered, "It must know this is a safe place." Jenna stroked its back gently and replied, "Because someone once stood here and didn't back down." The street lamp cast shadows of the trees onto the sidewalk, and in the place that was once the epicenter of a conflict, there was now steady breathing, soft footsteps, and a tangible feeling. Justice doesn't always require punishment. It just needs a place where people can sit down, exhale, and start to understand each other again. One early morning, with a lingering chill in the air and the sun still hidden behind the rooftops at the end of the street, Jenna stepped into the yard. In her hand was the familiar garden hose, its soft coil looped around her wrist. No footsteps echoed on the sidewalk. No eyes peeked from behind curtains. No phones were raised to record. It was just her, a green lawn fresh from its first watering of the season, and a steady stream of water reaching the base of each flower. She moved slowly, not out of fatigue, but because every motion now carried new meaning. No longer resistance, no longer proof. Simply the return of something that had always been right, now recognized without explanation. Behind her, the door opened quietly. Tobias stepped out in a worn gray t-shirt and old pants. He carried 2 mugs of coffee. One he set on the porch step, the other he kept. Taking a first sip, he said nothing. Jenna turned to look at him. Their eyes met no nod, no smile. Just a shared gaze saying everything was calm now, not because it had been forgotten, but because it had been overcome. Behind them, the old HOA office door had been removed the week before. A new sign had yet to go up, but inside, a group of residents now met no titles, no designated spokesperson. Just people who once objected are now choosing to listen, and people who once stayed quiet are now starting to speak. An elderly man brought a copy of the neighborhood charter, saying it should be displayed where everyone could see. A single mother proposed setting regular meeting times, not out of obligation, but because people should know each other before they know their rights are in danger. No one mentioned Jenna or Tobias by name, but every discussion carried echoes of the lawsuit. What mattered most, no one referred to it as a disruption anymore, but as a beginning. At the corner near the park, the stone bench with the quote that once went viral had begun to darken under the sun, but no one let it fade. Third-grade boy came weekly to wipe off moss, calling it the courage bench. When his mother asked who taught him that term, he said, "I heard it in the library." At that same library, young people had begun writing reports on community conflict, using the HOA case as source material. Some law students requested interviews with Jenna, but she declined. Tobias also turned down invitations to speak at military programs. They didn't need to retell the story. What needed saying was already there in the eyes of those who once stayed silent, now speaking up at the right moment. And in the simple habit of a woman watering plants in the early morning, plants that never asked for a permit. The morning passed like any other, without incident. A sparrow landed on the fence, looked around, then hopped onto the running hose. Jenna gently turned the nozzle so as not to scare it, the stream of water shifting course and touching the stone tiles of the walkway. Each droplet lingered, as if to say this place once held conflict but now only carried traces, enough to remind, no longer enough to hurt. Tobias lifted his coffee mug, sat on the step, eyes following the path of the water. Jenna set the hose down, walked over, and sat beside him. Both looked straight toward the street, where children were playing tag, unaware that a struggle had once unfolded right there. Then Jenna softly said, "Maybe it'll rain tomorrow." Tobias answered just as quietly, "Then today's the day to tend the plant." No one laughed, but it was as if the whole neighborhood exhaled. The boundary had been redrawn, not with fences, not with warning signs, but with trust. And silence once again became the clearest proof that justice doesn't need to be loud to be real. It only needs people who know how to stand, at the right place, at the right time. On the old HOA bulletin board, once filled with stern red print like "prohibited, fined, per clause," now hung a single white sheet, handwritten in blue ink. New rule: respect human boundaries before landscape ones. No signature, no official stamp. Yet the paper wasn't torn down or replaced by a formal notice. It stayed there, a quiet reminder that this neighborhood had overcome a dispute not just to reclaim a personal right, but to redraw the line between regulation and humanity. Everyone who passed by stopped to read, not to react, but to reread, each in their own way. An old man with reading glasses gave a gentle nod. A young mother took a photo to send to her daughter in law school. The paper, though simple, stood like a quiet declaration, not passed by any board, but affirmed by the quiet shift within a community. Those who once stayed silent now understood. Rules can be rewritten, but character must be restored. Behind Tobias and Jenna's yard, near the small fence where the struggle once happened, a young olive tree no higher than a knee was growing day by day. No plaque, no monument, no one called it the Justice Tree or gave it any poetic name. It was just a tree, planted on the afternoon after the hearing, when the sun had softened and the soil was still damp from the morning rain. Jenna had brought it out herself. No speech, no invitation. She dug a ring into the soil, placed the tree, packed it gently, and watered it with the very hose that had once led to her being shoved. Tobias stood a few steps away, not helping, not stopping her. He let her do it as a personal ritual, not to close a chapter, but to start something that didn't need ceremony. Since that day, the olive tree has grown, The leaves were thicker, the stem straighter. Around its base was a small circle of stones, hand-placed, holding moisture in. The kids in the neighborhood sometimes ran past, stopping to see if the tree had bloomed yet, then ran off again. An older neighbor, during his walks, paused to straighten a shifted stone or pluck a weed. No one had been assigned to care for the tree, but it was cared for. What made that tree special wasn't its species or its shape. It was the fact that it was the first to be watered after everything ended, no permit, no justification. And since then, no one has asked if they are allowed to water their front lawns anymore. Instead, they asked which plants were hardy, whether morning or evening was better for watering, or if someone could look after their garden while they were away. Something once treated as a threat had become a bond, and it started with one person who held the line when everyone else tried to blur it with rules. One weekend afternoon, as rain threatened, Jenna came out carrying a small bag of compost and mixed it into the soil around the olive tree. She didn't need a reason. It wasn't for beauty. The tree was growing, and she knew some things needed to be tended by hand, with consistency not assigned to regulations or watched over by cameras. Tobias, inside the kitchen, looked out, not following her exact motions, but quietly observing life returning the way it was meant to. A child on a bike rode past, turned his head, and called out, "Miss Jenna, is your tree doing okay?" She smiled, didn't answer directly, just gave a thumbs up. The kid nodded and pedaled on. No one filmed it, no one posted a hashtag, but change was taking root. In the memories of those who lived in Willow Ridge, years from now, they might not recall the exact day Jenna was shoved or the date the verdict came down, but they would remember a small olive tree and a handwritten note on the community bulletin board. Because sometimes, to remember a fall, people don't need violent footage. They need a reason to stand up and something that survived it all, quiet but unwavering, like a tree. And from there, the neighborhood no longer asked who had the loudest voice. They asked, who's going to water next? When everything settled, no more hearings, no more bulletin board debates, no more trending hashtags. What remained was the quiet transformation of a community's core. Willow Ridge had once been a neighborhood run on control of behavior, of schedules, even of what counted as proper. And then, a single shove, fall that seemed personal, cracked open the fault lines in a system long used to using law as a mask for power. Jenna never raised her voice, and Tobias never gave speeches. But from the moment she was pulled down for holding a garden hose in front of her own house, her eyes began to see differently. They saw how dignity could be stripped from someone in the simplest act, just because someone else assumed the right to judge how others should live, and they didn't look away. Their story wasn't about retaliation, but about the choice to make pain visible and turn it into a tool that forced the system to reflect on itself. From the viral video to the handwritten apology letters, from the courtroom challenges to the handwritten note pinned to the community board, every step wasn't meant to topple anyone but to ask again, who is the law meant to protect? And when law becomes an excuse for arbitrary action, who holds the line between right and wrong? Tobias was once a soldier, but his most critical battlefield wasn't overseas, it was here, in a neighborhood where each bowed head or averted gaze could become complicity. He chose not to strike back, not to parade his past, not to use his voice to preach. He simply stood literally at the boundary between his lawn and the public sidewalk, and that silence, precisely that, was what moved the system. As for Jenna, once deemed unfit just for her quiet insistence on living simply, she became the one who made others reconsider. A single statement at a community forum, "I don't need anyone to bow their head. I need them to stand up and understand why." No one filmed the moment she watered her garden again. No one reconstructed the scene. No statues were made. But trees were planted, rules were rewritten, apologies were made, and the idea of community began to expand. That was the real victory. No one was brought down, rather. Each person was invited to step out of the shadow of blind compliance. From that story, the lesson didn't come from a court ruling, but from how people respond to misused power. A garden hose, a fall, a word unspoken, can be enough to ignite change, if placed rightly and held with dignity. Silence stopped being submission, it became strategy. Resistance didn't require shouting, it required consistency. And community transformation didn't happen through meetings, but through glances, gestures, and how people treated a tree planted after a dispute broke out. Tobias and Jenna didn't become heroes in the usual sense. They became a new standard, the standard of quiet resolve that needs no persuasion, of dignity that isn't shaken by judgment, and of a belief that laws should not be feared but should remind those who uphold them why they were written in the first place. The story closed with a simple act, the woman watering her plants, the man setting down a cup of coffee. No declaration, no wrap-up. But everyone knew. That was the first time the neighborhood truly felt at peace, not because it was silent, but because it had learned how to listen. And from that moment, Willow Ridge stopped being a well-managed place and became a place where people began to understand each other.